Dr. Jennings is Quichua and Pasco Yaqui, and she grew up in Tewa lands in what is now known as Santa Fe, New Mexico. She earned her Bachelor's of Science from California State University, Monterey Bay, in Environmental Science, Technology, and Policy. She now resides in Tucson, Arizona on Ottoman Yaqui lands, where she completed her PhD at the University of Arizona in the Department of Environmental Sciences with a minor in American Indian Policy. Side note, I was able to attend her virtual dissertation presentation and it was amazing. Congratulations on that again. Her research interests are in soil health. You can follow her at One Native Soil Nerd on Twitter. Great posts. She's also interested in environmental remediation and Indigenous science practices. She's a 2015 recipient of the National Science Foundation's Graduate Research Fellowship Program, a 2019 American Geophysical Union Voices for Science Fellow, and is currently a postdoc fellow in Community, Environment, and Policy at the University of Arizona's College of Public Health. Outside of her research interests, Lydia is a very passionate trail runner and advocate for Indigenous representation in outdoor sports. And, you know, we've got to follow Lydia and read some of her articles and things that she gets published. And I'm hoping that she will share some of that with us this afternoon. I also know Lydia in a personal capacity, so thankful for her work and her friendship. So thanks, Dr. Jennings. Take it away.
Thank you, Nijun, and thank you, panel here for inviting me. I've been a SACNA's member since I was in community college, and it's been really instrumental in my own professional development. So I never quite envisioned being here, but I feel really honored to now be part of the presenters. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Today, I'm going to talk to you kind of a broad range of topics, but really around reclaiming mining lands in Southern Arizona, which is the focus of my dissertation work. But I've taken the approach of it doing both through science, storytelling, and soils, and really understanding what are soils on these deeper levels. And then just want to introduce myself in my language, Los Nshiniwa, and Nepo Lydia. And I'm actually today coming to you from Tewa lands in northern New Mexico, where I grew up. So I was raised, don't tell me what you know until I know who you are. And so I think this is really important to set the tone of what we talk about and kind of creating community amongst us here. So I'm a enrolled member of the Pasco Yaqui tribe. And then on my father's side, my mother's side, the Huichol, Wirikuta peoples. I'm a daughter, a sister, a fur mama to that rambunctious pup, Salchicha. And I'm a soil scientist. And it's taken me a while to recognize and identify as being a soil scientist. It's been a long journey, but I'm really thankful to be here today because they've influenced so much of my life. To talk about that academic journey itself, I mentioned I'm a really proud community college student. And to support myself to achieving this PhD goal, I worked in waitressing and hospitality. And I think those skills that I developed in that time frame are really instrumental to a lot of the communication that I do now. I earned my Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science at California State University, Monterey Bay. But leading up to that, I did internships in a variety of different more marine aquatic fields at Georgia Tech, at UC Santa Cruz, and the University of Southern California. And it was really this process of understanding aquatic systems and that really piqued this interest of soils itself. And then before I went to grad school, I also worked as a toxicologist for UC Davis. And that was really important in helping me think and really see on multiple levels how specific communities were being most impacted by environmental contamination, and also how landscape shapes how we think. So another part to thinking about how landscapes have shaped how we think is running. And running's been so influential to my life pathways and my academic pursuits. As Nijun's mentioned, I'm an avid runner, and it's been something ingrained in me since high school when my family sat me down and said, everyone in our family runs and you need to keep the tradition alive. Here's me at a point in life, maybe not enjoying it quite as much as I do now at a race, but also it's been this enduring relationship with myself and with the lands that I run with. till today. And that this is kind of a photo of me running in Southern Arizona in Tucson, and really ensuring that how running has been an important relationship with myself, the lands, and my ancestors. It also is important because it shapes how I ask the questions and the types of observations I make. As scientists trained in the scientific method, we all know the first step of that process is making observations. And so for me, as I ran through northern New Mexico and southern Arizona, and I would see these mine shafts and wonder, why are they there? What is causing them? I would also look at the vegetation around me and see specific plants growing in areas that they aren't growing in others, or why there's water pooling here and not other places, or why does the soil feel so different beneath my feet in one space opposed to another. And so I think it's really critical that we think about how our lived experiences and our place-based knowledge continues to inform this. And it was actually through that work with UC Davis, where I was driving all throughout the state of California, that I also really began to articulate those feelings. I noticed that in Southern California, the rivers were named after roads, but in Northern California, the roads were named after rivers, and how that really also was emphasized in how people interacted with their outdoor or nature or non-human kin. And I think it's that part of landscapes and how they shape us that's really important to my own personal scholarship. So as I thought about pursuing my PhD, I was really trying to talk to my community about what were important issues before I was to pursue that. And I began to think deeply about minings and how minings have impacted me on a personal level. So obviously I've talked about running across abandoned mine shafts. This is one in Southern Arizona. And it's part of this bigger legacy of boom and bust towns. And so they were a big part of why certain areas in the West were developed, because of the rich sacred veins that run through the mountains that have economic interest, but also it's left these big scars on the landscape. And I wondered, why haven't these been cleaned up? Why are these still here? The other part was seeing my friends and family uniquely on the front lines of protests. And this was really during the Idle No More movement. And it was something that was so predominant in my community, of my friends and family, but pretty much outside of Indigenous circles, it wasn't a big issue. And that continues to be as we continue to see Native people at the front lines of protecting sacred ecosystems. So that was another part of I need to understand this on a deeper level. The third was seeing this enduring legacy of Indigenous removal and environmental contamination. And that was really epitomized my first year of my PhD, as I was trying to figure out my advisor and seeing multiple mine spills happening both throughout the world, both locally impacting my community. And the Pasco-Yaqui, I should mention, are a binational tribal nation. And so some of our community in Mexico were being heavily impacted by mining and this huge mine spill that contaminated the water in this orange way. And that the agricultural lands to this day are still not able to produce food because of the contamination. We also saw that happen at the Gold King mine spill in the Navajo Nation, the Mount Poly mine spill up in British Columbia, where many of the tribal nations up there are subsistence fishers for salmon, and the fish are washing up on the shore without any skin. So I knew I had to understand this and wanted to understand this issue from multiple levels. As I looked at Arizona, we saw that 40% of the mines in Arizona are on or bordering tribal communities. So it's a big issue that we need to address. Arizona is also one of the largest exporter of copper in the United States. I think it produces about 75% of copper. So these are big critical issues for our communities, and science is an important tool to elevate these and address them. And it all came from my love of running and my love of landscapes, of our landscapes. So I've approached this issues through multiple lenses, and I'm going to go a little bit into the science. The first lens is this really soil science, environmental microbiology lens of understanding the biotic and abiotic indicators of reclamation, so the soil and the chemistry, and really seeing what the soil can tell us about its own health and how that impacts the plants that are able to grow there. And so these are just a list of a couple of the different indicators that we looked at. The lands that we looked at, that I studied, are lands that were leased from the Lenape Nation, so Indigenous land stewardship, but it was leased for about a 30-year period to have this land extracted. As they reclaimed or cleaned up this site, went back to Indigenous land stewards, the O'odham Nation, and they picked the types of plants and also how much soil was put onto this area. And we saw this interesting variation in plant coverage. I'm not going to go into the data, but that's just kind of to give you the general lens of understanding this part of my work really understands the soil health through Indigenous stewardship. The second part of the work was also understanding the policy, because there are so many mines that are happening that Native people don't want, but yet the legal system has not really been in our favor to support that. And so I wanted to understand this utilizing a local mine, the Rosemont mine, which is also in southern Arizona and sacred to multiple tribes, and really understand the National Environmental Policies Act, tribal consultation, the general mining law, laws that endure today, despite being established in times when tribal nations weren't always seen as being able to make their own decisions for themselves. And so this work really addressed these ideas and concepts around tribal consultation, which we think today consultation is better, but really a goal that we want to strive for is consent. And also tribes defining what is meaningful. And this is definitions that continue to be a work in progress. And actually, Najun, being a lawyer herself, can really speak to this. But I also want to highlight that this mountain, there's already mines in the proximity. It's also sacred to multiple tribes, including my own. And I bring this up because I'm going to talk a little bit more about this area in the latter parts of the presentation. The biggest findings from my work was that recognizing the general mining law and NEPA, there's a really uncertainty of what it means to consult, and also that they don't include traditional ecological knowledge as credible science, which I think so many of us in Sacanistas are really passionate about changing those. And so we know there needs to be reformation or amendments. A law that was created in 1872 should not continue to hold the weight it does today. But I think from these two perspectives of American Indian Studies and law and environmental science, I really saw that the pathway forward is braiding knowledge systems together, understanding both the scientific metrics of soil ecology and restoration, while understanding this transdisciplinary Indigenous scholarship to transform everyone's way of knowing is really critical to having resilient community decision-making into the future. And so that's something I'm really passionate about and will continue to be. But I think also what's critical and was missing is this aspect of storytelling and of communicating. And so many of the people I was working with at mining industry hadn't really thought about Native peoples because it wasn't part of their concern. And it was only because of these legal jurisdictions, and they still thought of us as people as the past that don't really exist. And so I think this aspect of advocating for ourselves and storytelling is so critical, but has often been missing from science communication. And we know Native peoples are inherently strong storytellers. Just watch Reservation Dogs and you will see the humor and the creativity that Indian country has. So I think this also catalyzed my interest in understanding what is science communication and how do we ensure these narratives are accurate and told by us, for us. But when we talk about science communication, what really is it? When I was trained, science communication was three primary ways: poster presentations, oral presentations, or manuscripts. And that's really missing out on so many other communities, particularly our communities that often aren't part of those esteemed groups, right? Scientists tend to talk to each other and not as much to communities. And that's changing, but that was really, I think, seeing that dichotomy or that separation, that siloed, there we go, was really instrumental for me wanting to explore how to be a better communicator. And so I pursued this Voices for Science Communication Fellow. But before that, I was doing communicating. I was on Instagram sharing what I was doing with my friends and family because they wanted to know why I was always in the laboratory. And so it was through this process of putting things on Instagram and communicating about it and making little quizzes, which actually helped me understand the process even better of PCR when people were asking questions about what I was doing. Anyone who's been in a study group knows the power of teaching your peers. And that's something that social media has been really helpful with, but then getting a more formalized training for the Voices of Science Communication Fellowship was also really helpful. But I also had to sit back and think that Native people, we've always been storytellers. And I look back at the OG Science Communication Fellowship, which is Camp Stories. And this is one photo, a photo of a project I'm part of, the Indigenous Food Knowledges Network. And this is Amy Wan of Atham, and she's an amazing storyteller and singer, and had all these people from up in Alaska dreaming about saguaro fruits and the Baidash harvest. And so I think, again, recognizing that expertise that our communities have always had for science communication is really critical. But it also leads to these important conversations of what is science communication? How are you explaining your research to your family, to your youth, to your elders? And how is our science accessible to those who are not scientists? And that doesn't mean necessarily not only explaining it, which, by the way, trying to explain PCR to your grandma is quite a challenge. How do you explain microbes? But also, how do we make this work relatable? How do we make people who don't really care about soil care? And then also, how are we ensuring this information that we generate is accessible to community members outside of publications? And so this is work that I've been really passionate about, in trying to find intersecting frameworks that we can ensure the general public care is not only about Indigenous identity and Indigenous knowledge, but even just about Indigenous lands and sovereignty. So I think a really important part of communication too is also looking at who is telling the stories. Now we know traditionally that has not been us. And so I've also, in the year of 2020, been really excited and critical to look at who are the scientists communicating, and also how are they communicating it. And part of it is that in soil science, there's not many Native soil scientists. In fact, we wrote a paper about it, the lack of diversity. Even though we know traditionally all of these lands that now make up America are traditionally Indigenous lands, that we've always been traditional land stewards, the typical degrees associated with this land stewardship, agricultural sciences, earth sciences, are really missing Indigenous peoples. And that's a problem that needs to change. I also just really want to highlight that there's this erasure in the data, right? We make up less than 1%. So in most of this data, we're not even represented in there. And this is a reason why I am so passionate about talking about these issues using a variety of mediums. Which takes me to this next phase. As I was finishing up my PhD in writing, and I was feeling pissed off, to be quite frank, that Native people have been writing for 150, 200 years about our rights to exist, our rights to manage our lands that are non-human kin. And that we're just erased from so many of these records, right? We've been advocating and doing this scholarship for so many years. And the other part that I started to feel really angry about and like frustrated about was how many people have gotten PhDs off of Indigenous knowledge, but without us. And I think today, nationally, there's 750 Indigenous PhDs total. I think that's definitely changing. But I really, as Black Lives Matter protests were happening and everything else is happening, I really wanted to have a list of our own experts, and continue to bring attention to that. Many people don't think we're out here, particularly as an Indigenous science communicator. I often get approached by people in multiple disciplines asking me for someone in their field that I don't know, I'm a student too. And so I think those were all factors, as well as that my year I was supposed to graduate, there was going to be 15 of us Indigenous people graduating. And that got canceled because of COVID, which totally makes sense. So these are a few of the sisters who got together after in 2021 and got together and took a photo to at least commemorate our accomplishments together. But this really got me thinking that I had to find my own way to celebrate my PhD process, because it is a journey and a process. It's a long trail with many peaks and valleys and false summits. And so this led me to deciding to do, also I should mention, I also wanted to think about how I thank those who have inspired me and pay those experiences forward. Because all of us are here as the result of so many who've mentored us and put their trust in us and written letters for us, or the product of our communities. So I decided to work with the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. I knew they had this Together Towards Tomorrow fund, and I didn't really want to be in charge of raising funding, but I wanted to do an honor run and raise scholarship funding for those students who maybe were much like myself and had worked in hospitality industry or supporting themselves through college, to go ahead and raise money for them who've been impacted by COVID. So that was kind of the purpose of this run, was to honor 50 Indigenous scientists of the past, present, and future, and recognizing that we've always been runners, though we've been missing from the outdoor industry imagery, and we've always been scientists, though we've been missing from the mainstream representation of scientists. We've been here, and we're going to continue to be here now and into the future. And that's my running pup. And so here are just a kind of a couple of snapshots of the people who I chose. I tried to focus on people who've mentored me personally, people who I've met, or people whose scholarship I cited. And what I want to highlight here is that many of these people I met through SACNAS and through ACES personally, and I've developed over the years these personal relationships. Dr. Chief was in my department. Dr. Duarte is from my tribal nation. Dr. Carroll is my postdoc advisor, right? And so I just think it's really important of us recognizing our own experts who mentor us and who continue to create these pathways forward. Here's if you know John Harrington, like a NASA astronaut. Do you know how many people are surprised that we have NASA astronauts coming from Indian country? It's great. I also got to learn about a lot of different people that I didn't know in researching it and looking at the scholarship. Like I wanted to find someone who was an atmospheric scientist and see where are there gaps in our current science paradigm that we continue to encourage youth to go into. So I think that was another part that was really powerful of this. From this run, raised about $9,500, so about $18 or $19 $500 scholarships for students. This is just one run, but the other part that's really powerful about this is that I've been working with outdoor industry, and the outdoor company Patagonia has actually made a short film about this run and about my own personal journey, and they're going to continue to be raising money on their website from this, and I'm hoping SACNAS will be able to talk about this, but I'm hoping that you'll continue to want it to be one of the partners, as well as ACES and the Ecological Society of America's traditional ecological knowledge. So I want this to be continuing to give. And I'm talking with someone, a book publisher, about making a kids book out of this list as well, because it's so important that we see ourselves in multiple capacities. And the profits would continue to go towards scholarship funds for Indigenous students. I also think this catalyzed so much interest. And I had been working prior to this on another project about running and soil. And so it's called We'll Run for Soil. And really to help the general public think and see soils differently. I see it all the time because I've been trained to think that, but also recognizing how the language we talk about soils is really off-putting. Like, what is an inceptisol? Most people don't know that. What's alluvial deposition? And so wanting to help the public have a bit deeper appreciation for soils. We actually did this run last week. It was 135 miles. Here's just a few of the highlights, but there are so many powerful ways that this running intersection with environmental science and Indigenous knowledge is so powerful and is so needed. And so, here's a cryptobiotic crust, this amazing community of microbes and cyanobacteria and lichens that takes thousands and thousands of years to grow. So imagining what my ancestors and ancestral Puebloans, and even before that, saw, right? These really cool Moki marbles, which are depositions of iron sediment in them that cool down in sandstone and create these kind of cool natural marbles. Or thinking about how the soils that we've collected along the route can make beautiful pigments and art. Traditions that we know Native people have always had with sandstone, sandstone painting, with earth pigments, with pottery. That's my attempt at art. That's not really my forte, but so I think these are really important parts to think about how we're communicating and how we're talking about this. And also, what does a scientist look like? What does it mean to be a scientist? How you can have multiple intersecting identities. There's not one definition of what it means to be a scientist. So those are other projects that I'm extremely passionate about. What I want to highlight though is because I think these are very communication-based projects, and a lot of people are curious how that leads into professional development. And I think these increasing in visibility through running and science have opened up multiple avenues for film projects, books, and teaching to a very ever expanding audience. I won grant monies and I'm working on publication credits for it. But I do want to highlight that I'm currently not seeing that academic spaces value this type of forward-facing engagement. And I think that's a problem. And I think we have been trained so much to talk to one another that these types of innovative ways that engage the public, that engage our community members, have not traditionally been valued. And I vow to continue to work to change that, because I think this is exactly the type of infusion of passion that we need into our studies. So I've talked a lot about running and my own passion with science communication, but I think there's multiple reasons to move beyond an academic interest, which it's increasingly become. I think we have to continue to develop these types of self-care, whether it's through movement or other things, because we recognize that there's a mental health issue in STEM. On average, 1 in 4 adults experience mental health disorders in the United States, but in graduate programs, I think it's 1 in 3. And so we know that mental health is an issue, that there's a huge pressure to produce, and that results in sleep deprivation, poor diet, and lack of exercise. It's also having impacts on our bodies. And so this just came out in the New York Times this year with multiple faculty from the University of Arizona contributing to it, how medical school pressure is increasing infertility in women. So we need to have both a shift in culture around this always being constantly on, but also making sure that we are setting those boundaries of self-care. And so I kind of recognize that everyone is different in how that self-care looks like. Obviously for me, running is really important, but I took a poll on Twitter to kind of give other people what they do for their self-care. And I think there are really important ones. Big one is saying no and setting boundaries, which I'm increasingly trying to learn. I also have my fur baby. You can tell I'm obsessed with her. And so I think these are really important things to continue to think about as we progress and are a healthy community, because we can't create good science without being healthy ourselves. I also really want to encourage the faculty and supporters in the audience to recognize that if we want diversity in STEM, which we do want, because not only does it make better science, but it's just really critical for our communities, that we need to also support students' whole sense of being that enriches our scholarship. So there are multiple times in my academic pathway where I was told I run too much, and also that I was told to stop taking language classes. Those are core and central to who I am. And I'm really thankful that I didn't listen, because I'm always going to be me and a little bit different and stick out. And I'm proud of that. And I think it's made me a better scholar because of it. But I think it can be hard for people to mentor people who are different. And so for you students, if someone is telling you to change, I hope that you really stay true and rooted to yourself and to your community, because it's going to make you all the better scholar. And so I just really want to encourage that all of us to think deeply about the multiple ways our identities intersect with our scholarship and our self-care. So with that, Chuaka Yotesia, thank you for your time. I'm really excited to answer your questions. And hopefully I hit a range of topics that you'll be interested in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jennings. That presentation was just full of information and so many wonderful things that you pointed out and shared. And I'm just a little curious. I know that you had mentioned early on about where you grew up and what you saw starting out in terms of your interest. How did you manage? I mean, what did it take for you to get from your home community in I guess who and what supported you throughout that going from your high school to college, into graduate school? What were the most important things to help get you to where you're at now?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I mean, definitely family support has always been really crucial, but also having teachers and professors. I mean, really think I was going to be a scientist. I was taking, at the time when I started my college career at Cabrillo, I was taking political science with the intention of going into American Indian Studies, which like that all the classes were taught by non-Indigenous people, so I didn't like that. And then I started taking these science classes to meet my general requirements, and I really loved it. And I loved the classmates, and this professor saw this passion that I had and kind of pulled me in. And that's how I got my first internship. That began that pathway. And so it's been really kind of these academic angels and aunties who have pulled me in and helped me see my capacity. And you continue to cultivate those types of mentors. I think it's really important as students, and actually I think in all stages of our career, right, is to have a network of mentors, not just one. And sometimes those mentors are going to be peers. Sometimes those are going to be more senior faculty. And sometimes, you know, you end up being mentored by the students that you're supposed to mentor. But I think those have been really pivotal pathways. It's also been people telling me you should apply for this fellowship, even though you feel insecure. And having that network of mentors who I still send some of my applications to today to read, because I think we all need support, and none of us get into these places by ourselves. I think that's just the sum of it, which it takes a community.
Yeah, thank you. I was really interested too in some of the data that you shared, the statistics, especially where it comes to showing the number of Indigenous scholars that we have going into these specific fields. And I know that it's a little challenging for our students to really find their way, you know, into those areas. And you know, our hope is, you know, that we can provide opportunities and resources and, you know, help these students build their network so that they can move ahead and move forward into these disciplines. I really appreciated too the words that you shared are about, you know, kind of the braiding of the disciplines and how important that is. Could you kind of expand a little bit more on that? Because I just really, I was like, wow, that's so true. You know, you don't really think about, you know, the two backgrounds that you had and how those really come together. How did that, yeah, it was just how you worded it was really beautiful.
Yeah, so I often phrase that my scholarship is that braiding of knowledge. And so it's braiding this environmental microbiology strand. And let me start by saying, we know when you braid someone's hair that each strand alone can be strong, but when you braid them together, they're that much more resilient. And we have to have resilient solutions to address climate issues. And so one strand is going to be that environmental science and microbiology and what I would call more settler colonial science methodologies. But another strand has to be informed by the land stewards in which we work with and their long-lived expertise, because our communities are surviving 500 plus years of colonization. Obviously, we know something about survival and about being resilient. And then I think the last part is, this third strand is kind of these outdoor experiences and place-based learning. That is the academic term. I think of it as trail running, but really this knowledge around our land bases that not only do Indigenous knowledges have, but also you can have on a contemporary or a smaller time scale. I mean, I just think about how I've gone running and I've seen how much climate change is impacting areas in the Sonoran Desert in a very relatively short time span. So I think those three braids, or those three strands, that when we braid them together, it's a much more robust understanding of our environmental or scientific issues.
Sure. All right, so we have a question from Charles, and I'll go ahead and read it. I always hear how representation matters. It's changing for the better, though. How did you manage to stay afloat in academia when you would get discouraged, feel defeated, or just hardly see anyone who looks like you, especially in the beginning as you're growing into who you are today?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I did my undergrad in California, away from my homelands and away from a lot of Indigenous people where I was at. And so I think I was found, you know, community by proximity. And so a lot of my close friends were Mexican scholars or Black scholars, and, you know, people who I felt like understood this marginalized identity. But when I pursued my PhD, I was very intentional about going to a campus that had many Indigenous scholars, And particularly the University of Arizona was attractive because that's where my own tribe is at. And I went to an all Indigenous high school, so I had that support there, and it's many of those classmates that I knew in high school that continue to be my family of support. And in fact, many have actually come to the University of Arizona. And so I think holding on to those networks and supports early on in life have been really important. But I think throughout this whole process, it's been having a solid support network, because there have been times when you get told something and it just crushes you and you're like, why am I doing this? And in fact, it happens multiple times, right, in this process. So I think that is important. My family, just always having my back. If I had to just come home and cry, I remember working on my dissertation, and the best way my mom could show me support was like, by just bringing me tea and leaving me alone. But like, I knew that that love was there. And so I think those are all really important. I'd also am so grateful to my mentors at the University of Arizona, who are kind of teaching me how to navigate this pathway as Indigenous academics and not fitting into any silos. One thing that we often hear is like, you walk in two worlds, and they're like, there's no two worlds, like this is the path I walk. And I love that mentality. And I love that. I think that another, false silo that many Native students get presented is like, do the settler colonial science methodologies now, and then like you can do your Indigenous stuff later on. And I think one thing that's been really great about my mentor, Dr. Carol, is that she's like, no, you can do it all simultaneously. You don't have to separate yourself or silo yourself, because we need the work now. So I think those have been really important parts of uplifting and changing my scholarship for the better.
That's really great, and great to hear that you had such a supportive, faculty to encourage you, to embrace both. And I think that's where a lot of our students may feel as though that they can't do that, right? That they can't acknowledge, their traditional cultures and knowledge into these spaces. So that's really good. That's really encouraging to hear. That was a really good question. Thank you for asking that, Charles.
And one thing I'll add on that too, right, is that's like I feel like a difference between having an Indigenous advisor versus a non-Indigenous advisor who doesn't always know how to mentor an Indigenous student, just because it's a lived experience they don't have. It's no fault of their own. They want to be encouraging. And so their definition of success has been like, do really solid science, and you can do that work later on. And I think that is part of the difference, is a Native faculty member recognizes that these challenges we have now, and they also have a network to help you find that support. So this is why I'm also going to give a plug of like hiring more Native faculty.
For sure. No, for sure. That's so true. So true. And we see that all over. So yeah, that was really good. Thanks for sharing that. Let's see. Another question that I had for you was in regards to the information you shared about the mental health of our STEM professionals, our STEM students. And that's something that I feel we don't talk enough about. And I really would like to see a little bit more in terms of that. I mean, I've worked with students, I work with grad students who live night and day in labs, right? And it's like, just trying to get them to, take those much needed breaks. I understand that there's just so much pressure. And again, do you have more words of advice in terms of, and maybe expand a little bit more on what you shared? Because I again, like I said, I feel like such an important topic.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it was something that I was really intentional about including, because I do think it's not discussed enough. It definitely was not discussed enough for me, that mental barrier, and especially when you're from an underrepresented identity, and you don't have people who understand the same pressures. And I think many Native students that I know are supporting their families in some capacity, and that's a lot of pressure, in addition to being a marginalized identity. And there's a lot of people who don't understand those pressures. They're like, just ignore them and be selfish. Like, that's not something you can do, right? So I guess for me, what's been really important is I go to therapy. I think it's really critical to not have stigma about therapy, and having someone who's outside of the patterns that you see in your life are really important. We need more Indigenous therapists. if you're at a university, usually you're able to get some kind of reduced tuition or reduced visitation. So that's, I think, something that we should really take advantage of to break those generational traumas. And I think, yeah, I guess like that's a really big one is therapy, and sometimes, you know, prayer, all of those different parts, because just recognizing that it's an issue is really hard, and it's really scary to take those first steps, but it's definitely made all the difference for myself, and I'm still working. It's a lifelong process is what I hear.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. And I wholeheartedly agree with everything that you said. There's just, you know, we do need more Indigenous people in these various fields. And I think one of the things too that I encourage students, you know, whenever I work with them, I speak with them is, you know, to always remember where you came from and to, you know, your family's there, and to call upon, you know, those things that you were taught growing up. And it could just be, you know, the simple things too. Yeah, so again, thank you for sharing those words.
Yeah, and you know, one thing that I just want to add to that, right, is that there are a lot of things that we see that uniquely impact Native people. So I remember doing my PhD, and when Standing Rock was happening, and seeing water protectors get blasted with cannons, and it was like so infuriating, and I couldn't sleep, and I felt so anxious, and like, but trying to talk about it with other people in my lab, like that wasn't, they were barely learning about what Standing Rock was. And so I think that like that dichotomy is just so challenging, right? And I know many of our Black colleagues also felt that during the Black Lives Matters, those similarities. And so I think this is exactly why we need to be having these really critical discussions as part of graduate school, as part of recognizing the self-care of that. So that's all I just wanted to add on, sorry.
No, thank you. Thank you. That definitely, I mean, you know, you hear about these different experiences, and of course we want to be there for our students, and we want to help them process, you know, because that's a lot. That's a lot to especially if you're there, if you were there, you know, to see those experiences. And again, you know, it just makes the world a difference whenever you do have other people that understand and want to understand too, that can listen to you. So that's great. Thank you for bringing that up. Thank you for bringing those two things up. The next thing I wanted to ask you about was your running, and just curious as to what the future holds for you. I mean, you've attempted and you've done so many things, and I don't see you slowing down anytime soon. Do you have any other plans to do any more awareness, even how you included that with what you do?
Yeah, I do have a future plan. We're still in the works, but it's going to be a Black Indigenous solidarity run in Oklahoma, and kind of discussing our shared histories. And I think recognizing the past pains, but also the pathways to liberation is through our shared process in that. And so hoping to do that in April, but we still have a lot of logistics to work out. But I think running and science, they have curiosity in this, they have curiosity in the ability to want to continue to push forward in common. And so, you know, I was driving back on Sunday night and like, what is my next big adventure going to be? And like, well, we've been talking about this one, and I think it's a really, you know, I really try to make my runs meaningful, not so much about hitting a specific distance, because I think then it's so much easier to surpass the pain. So like this 135-mile run, I had huge blisters on my toes. My blisters had blisters. I had them on my ankles, and it was just really rough. But I think recognizing that bigger purpose of honoring the soil and of education made me like a surprise what my body is capable of. And so I think I'm less interested in like doing fast races and more in meaningful races. Or meaningful runs, not even races, but meaningful purpose.
Yeah, no, I hear you. That just makes all the sense to me. I enjoy running. I don't run as far as you, but I do enjoy getting out there. It's just it's a really good time. I call it my me time. Just being able to get out there and think through things, and especially, you know, if you're starting out early in the morning, or you know, just to end your day, that's a really good way to spend your time. And I would really love to learn more about the event that you have planned for next April, and definitely would like to share it with our members too, and throughout Indian country as well. So.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to add too is I talked a little bit about that run, the 50 miles for 50 Indigenous scientists. And so that film, the preview for it will be dropping on Indigenous Peoples Day. And then we'll actually be having the first screening in Pasadena on October 21st. And I think we're gonna have several of the people who were honored on that run attend. And so I'm happy to share that with SACNAs as well.
Yes, please do. Please do. We definitely will make sure that that gets out to our community as well. So that sounds wonderful. All right. Well, we are going to be wrapping up here soon. And I am just curious to see if there's anyone else that may have a question for Dr. Jennings before we let her go. Again, just so grateful and thankful that you were able to join us and to share your experiences, and I know that a lot of what you said resonated with me, and I have a lot of head shaking here too as you were speaking through some of the things. So, so I think, yeah. So I think we are going.
Again, thank you for the honor.
No problem. Yeah, and again, please feel free to share with me the resource that you have for everything and anything that you have coming up. And then I will definitely get that out to our membership as well. So thank you everyone for taking time to join us for our keynote speaker today.